Exodus chapter 17, we're picking up where we left off in chapter 16, where God had provided for them manna from the heavens. God was providing supernaturally the bread that they needed to eat, and God tested them to see if they would follow his instructions, and many of them did not do what God asked them to do. In addition to grumbling and complaining, they didn't do and follow what God asked of them. Let's see what happens in chapter 17. It says, the whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. They're grumbling again. Moses replied, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? Why do you challenge the authority or the representative of the Lord? Moses was the authority or representative that God had put in place. He basically is saying, when you quarrel with me, you're quarreling with the Lord. Why do you keep doing this? Verse 3, but the people were thirsty for water and they grumbled against Moses. There's that word again. They grumbled, they complained. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people, God? They are almost ready to stone me. They're about to have an insurrection. I'm going to die, God. What do I do? Verse 5, the Lord answered Moses, go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massa and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Really, the Bible then begins to transition in verse 8, and we'll read about it in a minute, to a different story if something takes place. But these 7 verses that were shared with us are really shared to reveal to us that there was something inside the Israelites. We see this continually taking place throughout the wilderness. There was something inside of them that quarreled and complained and grumbled against God. They were impatient. They were unsatisfied. They were free physically. We've mentioned this before. But mentally, they were not walking in the fullness of freedom that God has for them. They didn't really understand or comprehend what it meant to rest or walk in the rest of God. And so we keep seeing these problems after problems after problems. Maybe in some ways God tells us all these stories to show us the long-suffering and patience of God before he finally makes a judgment, a righteous judgment, and says that that generation would not enter into the promised land, but it was the next generation's portion to go in. Verse 8, the Amalekites, verse 8, came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. These great men, these great leaders were standing and they were watching the battle from the top of the mountain. But here's something interesting. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. Can you imagine as if Moses has his staff in his hand and he holds up his hands. And as long as his hands are held up, the people of Israel are winning. As long as his hands are held up, really in many ways, it's a sign of worship before the Lord. As long as they're worshiping, as long as he's worshiping, Israel's winning. But when he gets tired, when he gets weary, when he drops his hands, when he drops his guard, when he drops his worship, it says the Amalekites were winning. So when Moses' hands grew tired, I love this, verse 12, watch this principle. They took a stone and put it under him and he sat. And Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. I find it so interesting that when he didn't have the strength in his own to continue for what God had called him to, people in his life held up his hands. The principle that we can take and apply to our life is this. Whenever we feel weary, we need to have people that are around us who are like-minded, who love God, who serve God, and ask them in our tough times, help hold up my hands. Help hold up my hands. I can't do this on my own right now. I'm not going to stop battling for the Lord. Help hold up my hands. Incredible picture God shows us. It says, so Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. Here's what's cool. It wasn't even Moses who was fighting the battle. Moses was interceding. You say, what does that speak to me? You might not be fighting the battle, but you might be interceding for your kids. You might be interceding for your husband or for your wife. You might be interceding for your friends. Keep on interceding. There is a real spiritual battle that's taking place. And even though you might not physically be walking it out right now, spiritually, you can stand in the gap and intercede just as Moses did for God's people. Verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name name of Amalek from under heaven. For Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, because his hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation. Let's continue into chapter 18 and read another story that God would share with us. It talks about Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, would visit him, and he really gives him some leadership counsel that I think is really cool for us to learn from. It says, now Jethro, the priest of Midian and the father-in-law of Moses, heard of everything God had done for Moses and for his people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. After Moses had sent away his wife Zipporah, his father-in-law Jethro received her and her 2 sons. One son was named Gershom, for Moses said, I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. And the other was named Eleazar, for he said, my father's God was my helper. He saved me from the sword of Pharaoh. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, together with Moses' son and his wife, came to him in the wilderness where he was camped near the mountain of God. Jethro had sent word to him, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and 2 sons. Basically what happened when Moses went to Egypt, it was there was a lot of things that were going to be taking place. There were a lot of things that were dangerous. It's possible that his family stayed with Jethro during certain periods of time, and eventually Jethro and Moses' family came back to meet with him and to be reunited with him. Verse 7, Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him. They greeted each other and then went into the tent. Moses told his father-in-law about everything the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptian for Israel's sake, and about all the hardships they had met along the way, and how the Lord had saved him. Jethro was delighted to hear about all the good things the Lord had done for Israel in rescuing them from the hands of the Egyptians. He said, praise be to the Lord who rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians and of Pharaoh, and who rescued the people from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods. You'll notice it says the Lord, capital L-O-R-D, the name of God, whether it be, we don't even really know fully how it's pronounced, whether it be Yahweh or Jehovah or some different variation. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D is the Hebrew of the Lord, his holy name. You'll notice it says is greater than all the other gods, little g, not a big G. When it refers to God, it's referring to God, the Lord. When it's little g, it's false gods or idols that people have. It says that the Lord is greater than all the idols, for he did this to those who had treated Israel arrogantly. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and other sacrifices to God. You'll notice the big G. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. The next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw that Moses was doing for the people, he said, why are you doing all this? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning to evening? Basically, he says, you're going to wear yourself out, Moses. Moses answered him, because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it is brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and instructions. Moses' father-in-law replied, what you're doing is not good. It's not wise, Moses. You haven't set yourself up to win as a leader. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You can't handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I'll give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions and show them the way they are to live and how they are to behave. But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Basically, he says you need a leadership structure, and you need to appoint leaders who are godly, who are trustworthy, and are honest and have integrity. You need to appoint the right leaders so that you know that they not only carry your heart, but they carry the Lord's. He says, have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter because they will share it with you. If you do this and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied. It says that Moses listened to the wisdom of his father-in-law and did what he said. He chose capable men from all of Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. Then Moses sent his father-in-law on his way, and Jethro returned to his own country. Interesting story that's shared with us in chapter 18. Basically, the principle or the premise that we can take and apply to our life is this. God has placed in our life capable men and women to help us with what God has called us to do. You don't have to carry the weight alone. You don't have to do it all by yourself. God has placed and positioned people in your life to help you, and God has placed you and positioned you in the lives of others to help them. We don't need to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. Christ has already done that for us. But the weight that we have been entrusted with, we can share with one another and we can strengthen one another. But the Bible was so specific. It says, appoint individuals who fear God, who are trustworthy, and don't like dishonest gain. Basically, find men and women of integrity that love God and value God more than their own fleshly desires. Show me your friends, and I'll show you your future. It's a basic premise. Surround yourself with the right people. Use godly wisdom, and you'll be blessed. Be blessed today.